Welcome, I'm Steve Johnson. This is Digital Works TV, and we have a very, very special guest, Brian Odom, who is not only the historian for Marshall Space Flight Center, he is the chief historian for NASA. And Brian, we could probably spend 10 minutes talking about how the heck that happened.
Sure, yeah. It's a twisted road.
But it's one of those things where you had responsibility and now you have responsibility.
That is true, yeah. Being at Marshall Space Flight Center gave you the ability to kind of focus in really on Marshall's history, which is, as you know and you're aware of, is really, really diverse history. So, but looking across the agency at all these other centers, encountering things I hadn't encountered at Marshall, the whole aeronautics portfolio, all these things, it's something.
We at Digital Works, we're involved with model-based systems engineering, and which is the wave of the future where we're wanting to help move everybody to that. But I thought it would be fun to at least start out talking about how, the Apollo program, which is kind of what we base all of our space exploration on. We compare it, whether we think about it or not. That's like the one that that did all the incredible things. But we need to talk a little bit about the fact that they didn't have computers, at least not enough computers to matter. They didn't have watches that had more power than a hand calculator.
That's right.
They didn't have that stuff. So how do we get to the moon with the technology we did have, in the 60s?
And that was the thing about Apollo, is that a lot of it had to be invented. And that's what made Kennedy's, declaration so bold, that we're going to do something that along the way, we're going to have to change the way we think about technology.
Yeah.
What's possible. They'd had some experience of launching people in low Earth orbit, all these things. These are very small scale systems, but you upscale so quickly. And you think about the Redstone test stand out at Marshall, where they were testing that Redstone from 1953 forward. In just a few years, they're going to upscale from about 24,000 pounds of propulsion thrust up to 7.5 million pounds of thrust in the first stage. And the leap that it takes to do that, the guidance computers for Apollo and all that. But all these things have to be invented. People have to think of new ways, use what they have, think of new ways to do it, but relying on these old systems, the slide rules, all these things.
Yeah, the slide rules and people actually doing math on a piece of paper.
Yeah, doing math. We see these in all of the Hollywood movies, really, as people thinking about that, from Hidden Figures, thinking about John Glenn's fight, verification of numbers. Even though you have these new systems, do you trust them enough to do this? And so we've got to verify and check. So even in the later, in the later version, in the later era of Apollo, you still do have this verification that's very much relying on human mind.
When you talk to people, or I would have bet that many people, they think, well, they did it on their computer, of course. That many people don't get that when they see this old video from the Apollo days, they see rooms full of guys, draftsmen, drawing the plans on, making blueprints of the parts for Apollo. And they don't really see somebody using a slide rule, but they did. I mean, it was what they had, but most people would consider that just too primitive to think about, the way they had to do things.
And especially associating it with something that was so, such a leap forward. That those two things were in parallel with each other. Like you said, the old Hick building downtown, to see those draft tables. Just to see that room full of tables. People kind of like monks, slouched over the table with making these drawings that are beautiful. I mean, you go back and, we have some of those in the archive, and you look at them and they're just absolutely beautiful.
And they have the Saturn V archive, a big archive at UAH.
Exactly.
And you can go and look at the plans.
Yes.
And, that's another thing, the volume of paper associated with Apollo. I know we're supposed to be in a paperless world, but that's not so. We're still, it's hard to let go of having it on a piece of paper too, but still there's so much less paper involved with a modern rocket design. It's on computers.
All the digital tools that you have right now. There still is a lot of mental work going on in the background to get these things right, verification, all that kind of stuff. But you're right. The amount of paperwork and configurations and one change at one place creates a whole ripple effect. And people like Bill Snead, who was part of that configuration management team for Apollo, who's still around with us today. The amount of oversight and control that you had to have to make sure you didn't, things didn't slip, creates that mountain of documentation that you have to manage. And and that's one of the things about that is producing this paper record leaves that trace of those changes. And from a historian's perspective,
you were just saying everything was on paper.
Yeah, right. and we know so much about Apollo because of that, and because that was maintained in these archivists.
I didn't think about that.
And we know more about Apollo than probably people will know about Artemis later on because of that paradigm. And we as historians in charge of archives and that sort of thing, that's one of our big problems is how will we tell the story long term of this by making that archival record that's born digital, these computer drawings. How do we do that?
Okay, so we have Apollo and all the paper and the slide rules and the people doing math, but it started changing during the creation and flight of the space shuttle. Because am I correct, the laptop was developed that was something that NASA needed on the shuttle, am I correct? I feel like I've held a laptop in my hand out at U.S. Space and Rocket Center, much heavier, bulkier than what people have now.
You think about what they were asked to do, that living and working in space concept, right, versus the Apollo, which is the transportation paradigm. We're going to go and we're going to come back. But once you get to low Earth orbit with the shuttle program, with Space Lab and all these things in the payload bay, you're going to have to do this work, that you're going to have to follow these procedures and steps. And really the paper trail for that, you've got to compress that down. That's where these digital tools for on orbit become so important. So you want these innovative techniques and tools that help you do that.
As a historian, can you see the incremental steps toward going from the Apollo years, the paper, let's just call it the paper rocket, up to now where just about everything's on computer?
Without a doubt. The databases that these, the records management program hasn't changed, things that are scheduled. We're creating permanent records, temporary records. But if you look at, if you take a look under the hood of Artemis right now, in these databases where they're saving these files, it's completely different. I mean, this is something that, and a lot of people assume that digital is easier, right? The digital, digital control, making sure you're there.
It is for teenagers.
In a way, right? But But the proliferation increases really more dramatically in the digital world than it would have in the paper world. And so, just because you don't have the paper trail, the digital amount of information you have is prolific.
And one thing to always remember, there's a baseline here, and that's the engineers.
Yeah.
What we're talking about, the paper, the computers and all that, those are tools that the engineers use to get us enough power to get off this planet and go somewhere else.
You got it. And communicate with each other. I mean, because the team, again, going to go back to how large the scale of Apollo was. And, you think about everything that was involved in that here at Marshall, at the contractor facilities, test facilities, out in California where they built the S2 stage, the S4B stage out there, the second and third stages, and managing that and changes across one impacting others at those interfaces. And so these communicating, locking in what's happening, and then communicating that back and forth across interfaces creates that.
Okay, it would be easier now, wouldn't it? Because, only because, if you can send somebody an email or you could, rather than having to get them on the phone.
Yeah.
So in some ways, the communication is helped by the fact that you have different ways to communicate, whereas in Apollo, you had to be talking to a human being.
Well, but the proliferation because of that and the loss of control, right? So how do I know what emails are being sent if there's no mechanism for capturing it, right? And so the ability with so many ways to communicate across so many platforms, the loss of control, which in Apollo it was more standardized, right? Well, the standards are still there. But the thresholds for
I have heard that during the Apollo years they would have these big meetings, and with Warner Brown running them, or the guys working for him, his managers, and everybody would show up to these meetings, and if you had a concern, you were required to voice it. They didn't want anybody. Well, I was embarrassed. They wanted to hear it, and they would figure it out.
Yeah, and that was the way they'd always done things, right? They'd done those, even back to Pinamunda, but even with the Redstone, because with the Mercury Redstone program, you get a failure, you need to know immediately because you're not going to be successful if you don't do that, and that's never changed, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have that transparency and that communication channels that are open, safety mission assurance that is all part of that, technical authority. All these things make sure that everyone who sees something can say something, because it's so important, because it saves time in the long run, because, and it can save lives.
You can't skip a step.
Ultimately. There's no cheating here, right? And the laws of physics are ironclad, right? You can't cheat, you can't get it wrong and hope that you succeed in spite of an error, right? And that's what makes it so hard. Is that. So yeah, the Von Braun team, all of these, during the Redstone program, during Apollo, the shuttle program, again, they were mentored by these people to understand how, and they always get this bad reputation to be very conservative engineering, right?
Well, one thing is like and I've had some of the guys who worked on Apollo tell me, talked about that, said, we tested, said we blew stuff up all the time.
Sure.
Well, one of the things that has changed, I think, is not the attitude of the engineers about testing, but the public seems to think if you test and it blows up, it's a failure. We need to fire these folks and start over.
Yeah.
But the failure is where you learn stuff that makes you better. Am I right?
Yeah, you're exactly right, because failure is so critical. Testing to failure can be critical because you know where the margins are, right? You may make it as robust as you can to pack in, this margin for error, but you don't necessarily know. The computer models can give you a lot now, and they're increasingly getting better, and we're verifying that those models are better with that test of failure, because you go back to Apollo with the F1 engine and combustion instability. They're blowing those things up constantly because they don't understand that process. But by doing it enough and by changing the way you mitigate with those baffles that are on that injector plate, you learn something over time by that failure. Structural integrity, like these pressure tests that you have or structural tests that you have, and they've still had those.
Well, but it does freak people out.
It does.
Like Apollo 8, am I correct? That carried people.
Yes.
And okay, that's the one where they had the pogo effect in the fuel, and they didn't. That was they didn't know it was going to happen.
Yeah, sure. That was the thing, because in November of '67 they launched Apollo 4, which is the first Saturn V. It's uncrewed, and it's just flawless. It's beautiful, beyond their wildest imagination. Apollo 6, that was launched later, did not go so well. It was uncrewed, but it had this pogo in the first stage, the J2 engines, all these failures in the upper stage. But the decision is made because of that geopolitical pressure, that existential threat that the Soviets might beat you again by sending humans around the moon. They make that bold decision on Apollo 8 to send those humans.
So the pogoing was before Apollo 8. Okay.
They had solved it. They understood again, by seeing the failures in Apollo 6.
Can we explain what that is exactly? It was how the fuel acted in the lines.
It is. It's basically the idea that you're getting vibrations. Think of it like a pogo stick, right?
Yeah.
But on something so large as that, you get the oscillation up the top. And by the time you get to the top, the vibrations are enough that it could be damaging to the humans. And what you do is you basically have helium accumulators that you put in there to solve that, right? It's a baffle, really, that packs it down and stops that process. And, it worked great. Those accumulators worked really good. In fact, all of these issues find their way into the shuttle program, and they say, well, we needed baffles on the injector plate for F5, for the F1 engines. So maybe we need them for here. But ultimately, the engineers continue to say, I don't think we need those. And so, so there is this learning across that's so incredible.
But it's interesting. And one of the things, if you're an engineer who worked on any of those programs, it's like, and they did test a lot, and they did have test failures. But all these space programs are a series of figuring it out. Okay, we've got this problem. What do we do? And the engineers figure it out. And that has to make any engineer who ever worked with the space program feel really proud.
Well, because everything they do is so unique, right? And it's not like building, a particular type of bridge, right? Then you learn, you test, like Petrovsky talks about, failure in design and all these things. But once you get it right, it can be replicated. Well, by the time you get in the space program, you'll get it right, and now the mission changes, the technology changes, the spacecraft itself changes, new materials. Everything's always so unique. So your problem, the ability to replicate the solution to a problem is very limited.
And the other thing, besides people freaking out about test failures, they freak out about the fact it takes time to do every new rocket. And I've had one guy say, well, every rocket is different.
Every mission
but that is something that I think it's safe to say that the general public, folks like me,
Right.
have a hard time getting well, they did it, we've already launched it, but they've gone to the moon, why can't we just do it again?
Well, I'll give you 2 examples there. The mundane nature sometimes that creeps in to mission success, right? Where you say, well, the space shuttle is working, right? After STS-1, we go 4 missions, and it's like, it's operational. It's a truck to space now. You think you understand that system, and then you have a catastrophe, right? With Challenger. So the public, and then you move on from that, and you think you've solved that problem, and then it seems like it's just easy, right? It's safe, and that was the problem with Challenger. Before Challengers, they said, well, we can have a teacher in space, right? Because this is such a, I think, you see the same thing now. The public's, watching the SpaceX, the Falcon 9 launch, and it just seems like it's just routine now. I bet the people from SpaceX would tell you the same thing. These systems are always, we're learning constantly about where the margins are.
Well, I mean, and this is a crude way to describe it, but a rocket is a bomb with the end cut off.
You got it. I mean, when Alan Shepard takes his flight, basically you've replaced what was a nuclear payload, with a human being, these are controlled explosions.
They could not have thought about that very much. I'm not sure they would go.
Right. Yeah.
They were all test pilots too.
And the astronauts had an old joke, that they were on top of a rocket built by the lowest bidder. That was and they knew how dangerous it was. So, and even Gus Grissom, before the Apollo 1 fire that.
Well, I've read some.
And that's what he talked about. We're doing something that's very important here.
And this is not a criticism of NASA, but it is a fact that not everything, but much of what NASA has done and accomplished is money is always an issue, which is why some things weren't changed until after a problem, because it would have been expensive to do so, and the people providing the money don't want to hear that you can't get it done for that amount.
And that's the misconception with Apollo. People assume that Apollo had more money than they knew how to spend. That was never true at any time. From Kennedy, when Kennedy gets in the car after his call for the mission to the moon from Congress, he gets in the car and he says, I don't think those boys took that well. Not sure I'm going to get the funding. And he may have been right, because he's challenged the whole way. Then Jim Webb, who's in charge of the program for Kennedy and on, his job really was to go to Congress and ask for funding, because as we've talked about, Apollo was, and Marshall is a development center, and so from the very beginning, they're reading these challenges of getting the resources they need. They know they need tests, but a lot of these decisions in Apollo are driven, like the all-up decision. Now the Germans always had tested staged.
They wanted to do more testing than we actually did.
And they wanted to have, if they would have had their way, the first launch of a Saturn V would have been the first stage only as a live stage, then the second stage and the first stage, then the third stage. But the all-up decision is like, we don't have that kind of time because we're in a race to the moon here. We don't have those resources, and so we're going to do it this way. And so that's a massive change for them.
And that change continued with the shuttle, because the first shuttle flight had people on it.
It was crewed, and there were real challenges there. When they came back,
one of the astronauts, he couldn't quit smiling. So I said, why? Because he didn't think he was going to be walking around.
50-50, right?
This is Mike Rudolphi, who was a long time, executive at Marshall, worked for head of propulsion, head of engineering. He said space flight is hard. And I think we lose sight of that. It's like, some of the criticism for SLS, and it was the rocket. From what all I can tell and heard, it was wildly successful.
Sure.
I mean, there were issues, but it's like everything else that Marshall and NASA and anybody building rockets does. It's new. It's all new stuff.
And Artemis 1 flight was exactly that, right? It's a test of that system for the first time. All up test of that system with the Orion, on top of it, and then they get this feat. They learn from that experience, which is it's a test.
And they're still, and it takes time, and it's expensive.
Sure.
But once again, spaceflight is hard and expensive. And
the ability to accept risk. The acceptance of risk is critical in this.
Yeah. And I think we can see that every time has been a disaster or been a real problem, there is some second guessing and people going, should we even be doing this? But I mean, if you could have asked that throughout history.
Sure.
Should we be doing this? Because unfortunately, many great breakthroughs came at the cost of human life.
Sure.
Okay, so a couple of things. Well, I want to get to the engineering more in a second, but we'll talk about one thing that I'm not sure most of us have understood in the past. Marshall is a development center. I think you've already said that. And as a development center, once a rocket, the Saturn V is a perfect example, once the rocket is developed, then some of those jobs aren't needed anymore until there's a new program like the space shuttle developed.
Sure.
And the shuttle wasn't in development when the Saturn V flew.
Yeah.
So after a major development, it's no fun, but I mean the workforce changes some, and it's scary.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things that drive that, but you're right. Really, from the development center's perspective, you have this trajectory. You're moving up toward development, and once you hit that mark, you're going on the way down. A lot of people, this term we hear now, reduction in force, right? This was something that Marshall was facing as early as 1966. 3 years.
Yeah, people were being laid off right along.
With Apollo 11, the landing on the moon, it's a great celebration, obviously, but it's a recognition that a lot has changed. We've lost a lot. And what is it that we've lost? Well, we've lost expertise, right? Yeah. Human capital, right? We've lost those things, the ability to solve those problems, the people who knew how to test and understood that. So you do lose stuff. And the other thing that Marshall as a development center is facing at this time, in Apollo, was that it had gone into what we call the arsenal system, right? Where, the first stage of the Saturn V was designed, developed, manufactured, tested, and manufactured and built and produced the first few stages by Marshall Space Flight Center.
That is something, another thing I don't think most people get, that the initial development, the building, the blueprints, all that was done on site.
Yeah,
we built the rocket.
Yeah, you get it to ready where you understand it from end to end.
Yeah.
And then you transfer that process to a contractor, in this case Boeing, and then you have the ability to provide support. You have insight, you have oversight from a contract perspective, but you have insight into problem solving. When they encounter new problems, you can help because you know. Now, the second stage of the Saturn V was not that way. So the arsenal concept is the first stage. The second stage of it, the S2 stage, was different because Marshall didn't have that experience. Well, NASA didn't have that experience with big hydrogen-fueled systems.
Yeah.
So they had to find someone who did have that experience. Well, that was North American Aviation out in California. So Marshall's ability to manage and oversee that program was limited by not having done that first initial work that's in the arsenal system. So when people are being laid off, in 66, or that process is beginning at the development center, not only are are things changing programmatically, but things are changing from a procurement standpoint.
Yeah.
And that's something we see with the shuttle program, and it's definitely something we see now with Space Launch System.
And one thing about it, when you were doing something out in California, you could probably set up a TV feed, but a lot of cross-country flights for Marshall managers, for Apollo managers, Saturn V managers, they would have to go there and look at it, and then people would have to fly from there to here, as opposed to now when you literally can do things like that digitally. You can okay, here's all our information, here's what it did,
right,
and you've got that, just have a download.
Yeah.
And so in that respect, the digital age has made all of that
instantaneous.
It's instantaneous. So it was a much tougher deal. On the other hand, somebody said 1 year we're going to do this within the decade. 9 years later, you did it.
Yeah, and that's what so in Santa Susana, well, in Canoga Park out there. You would have, you had your resident manager's office, right? So you had those Marshall people who just had to go live somewhere else for a while, and they would sit, where now we'd have a Teams meeting, a Microsoft Teams meeting, or we'd have a shared server where we could just kind of interface with each other that way. But no, you had to have actual engineers living in California, sitting in those programs, and really learning as much from North American as they were learning.
And for them, I have to go back to Marshall to explain what our problem was with that. So that was part of it, having to travel.
Yeah, that Seal Beach, Seal Beach where they built that second stage, manufactured that. It became a very interesting moment here. because it is that inflection point where Marshall engineers
Yeah.
begin to become a transition from being an engineer who's building this thing from the ground up as to being a program manager in truth. Well, what do you lose in that standpoint, right? You know, you lose that ability to solve those problems. Those engineers out there were learning as much from North America as they were teaching North America.
Yeah. So this is an ongoing. I don't know if you call it a problem because it's just the reality of life. It is an issue that when development of one thing stops, you know, either there has to be a new program to develop or people move on.
Well, that's the thing, you know, at Marshall in this period, you know, because they had built it around this arsenal system, you know, they had the laboratories. People always talk about the working in the lab, you know, and that's what they were. And they had a lab specialization for each component of the rocket, right? Where they knew this stuff inside and out, material properties, all of these things, the propulsion lab, the test lab, you know, they interacted with each other, they interacted with programs. But by the time you get to the end of Apollo, there's organizational change that's happening. You know, no longer can we have what they began to believe were redundancies, right? You're now redundant to someone else. And we can't have this laboratory complex the way we had it. And that's a massive change.
So in the engineers themselves, of course now, and they didn't really call them that, but for now we have systems engineers who's and in my mind, I always think of Werner von Braun and maybe Ernst Stuhlinger and guys like that. They were systems engineers. They had their arms around the whole program. And they might not know the specifics of each little system. Sure. They had a pretty good idea.
They could connect the dots really well.
Because I've heard stories about technician would be working on something and he'd see somebody standing there and he'd say, could you hand me that wrench or hand me that? And it would be von Braun because he was out there looking.
They refer to that as dirty hands, right? You wanted to be in the work and to actually, you couldn't think of it as a theoretical thing, right? It had to be a practical thing. So how does it really work? And so to have that information and to have people with knowledge and experience at the top and seeing the system as a whole, as you say, as opposed to seeing being a master of one piece.
And it's easier to see it as a whole now, which is kind of what model-based systems engineering is. It's being able to do things digitally, which is as an engineer, it sure does make things easier, but the problems are no less complex.
Yeah, the systems engineer has to be the conductor of the orchestra, right? Has to know how to play all the instruments to some level of satisfaction.
So are there engineers out and you talk to everybody, are there guys that will say, Brian, it sure is different now than it was 20 years ago. We were doing this way and now we're doing it another way. It's like amazing. Do you hear talk like that?
Yeah, I don't think, but it's something we've already talked about. Everything is unique. So there's that recognition that's always good. But I'll tell you, it's funny how things change the more they stay the same, right? So, and the principles are still there. How it works, what system, what's our mission? So what system do we have? And then we figured that process out. Where it's like being a historian, right? The methodology, of the practice is always there. I'm going to treat whatever subject I encounter with the same principles and methodology, and that's what makes it really. That's what's going to produce an observable, a regularized effect, right, or output. And I think they understand that too. And I think. Another example is nuclear thermal propulsion.
Which is being worked on at UAH.
Which is a big part of this, because if we're going to do what the next mission might be, what's the next big leap forward, right? Well, nuclear thermal is that propulsion. Is going to be that system because it's going to get your flight time to Mars just cut by a third, by 2/3. So I mean that's kind of what's going on here. So great minds, and again, nuclear, like anything to do with space, you think space is hard. Well, nuclear thermal propulsion is very hard. Because how do you test that, right? How do you test these things? The systems that you have, the test for fuel that has to be hotter than the surface of the sun, temperatures you face there. Building those facilities is pretty tough. And then you're dealing with nuclear, and that's always scary for the
and good time to mention that Marshall has been the NASA's propulsion center for decades. Am I right?
You're right. Even before there was a Marshall Space Flight Center, when there was the back during the Redstone time from 56 to 60, from 58 to 60 when NASA's created, Marshall leadership is very much involved in NASA from a consulting standpoint, you might say that. But they sat on these committees that talked about propulsion. NASA knew from the very beginning that it needed that deep space, that heavy lift capacity that Marshall, that what would become Marshall would provide. So getting that from the Army was a critical thing. So that DNA goes back a long way.
So this is Marshall's 65th year. This is the 65th anniversary. As a historian, what is something that jumps out at you from 1960 to now? Just something that's happened, a progression. What would be the thing that as a historian you can say, you can see this if you look at the years?
Yeah, you can see, like you mentioned, being a development center, you can see the ups and downs, but you can see that, while the past doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes, as Twain says, This is what Marshall's history has always been about. I call it sometimes the travails of being a development center, is what the future is going to hold. But one of the things that Marshall's in its strength is its preparation for that day.
Yeah.
And that's always been it. Dealing with limited resources is not new to anyone. Everybody deals with limited resources. But how do you prepare for that day? The fact that high energy astronomy out at, that's at Marshall Space Flight Center, Marshall is has a specialization in that. Well, that was intentional back then, right? We're going to look for new work. What do we do in the meantime? Skylab, what do we use? How do we use what we have? So Skylab, the success of Skylab, America's first laboratory in space. The Apollo Soyuz test project, that anniversary is coming up, and utilizing these systems for as long as we can, bridging the gap, as you say, between up-ramping for the shuttle program or the end of the Apollo development to get to the shuttle program. It's not put in place until 72. So you're talking about 6 years there. Yeah. So in that process, Von Braun and the leadership team there at Marshall says, what are we going to do next? Or what do we do to fill the time? Yeah. Marshall gets into the high energy astronomy business, with these things, puts something together called a Program Development Directorate. We're going after work, right? We're going to build a diverse portfolio that will flex and survive. That's what Marshall does best, right? Okay. It survives, but it also gets into these new areas that are so beneficial.
Okay, so you can't prognosticate and you can't talk about what you hear in the halls.
Sure.
But is it safe to say that there are new things on Marshall's horizon, things that I don't even know about that are in the pre-development stage? Is looking at the history of the center, does it feel like that?
I think, that's I'm not in those, I have enough trouble looking back at Apollo.
You gotta wait done it so you can talk about it.
I gotta wait 20 years and then I'll get into it, right? But just looking at the history and looking at kind of, just the writing on the wall of what's happening and the changing of, and the potential, continuation of Artemis, obviously, to do something great there. What after Artemis, right? What's the next step there? Well, it's always been Mars. That's kind of the paradigm. So Marshall is going to be innovative in that, and we get back to nuclear thermal propulsion. One of the things that Marshall was never a part of was the old NACA, right? So in terms of aeronautics, founded in 1915, because the United States by that time, the birthplace of flight had fallen behind Europe. How do we build that back up, right? Well, we need expertise. We need the experts doing actual work in the labs and getting that right. Well, there's a DNA there too that it's part of NASA. And to be a center of excellence, what does that mean? Well, it means people come to you for answers, right? So you have got to invest in that human capital and then hone that, right? Allow it to thrive. Yeah. What kind of programs do you need? Well, this is the future, right? For the agency, I think.
Okay, and bottom line, there'll be an engineer's hand on a keyboard making this happen, right?
Right.
I was going to say with a pen, but it'll be a hand on a keyboard.
And probably in 20 years, people will laugh about the idea of a keyboard, like we're laughing about a slider.
Just say it. It'll be.
What do you mean? Why do you have to type it?
Thank you.
The tools are always changing, right? But again, the paradigm the paradigm of success is always there. How do you succeed in these things? I don't think that's really changed a whole lot. Yeah. Just the tools have changed. And this, you can get more, there are tools that give you precision. I mean, this is the way science works, right? We will uncover new things once our tools get better that we are living with now that we don't know about.
Okay, and the tools with digital engineering,
Sure.
it's all getting better daily.
It's changing daily.
You're a historian. Get out of here.
Right.
All right. Thank you, Brian,
Hey,
so much for
you
being
got it.
with
Thank
us.
you, Steve.
And thank you for joining us on Digital Works TV. I'm Steve Johnson, and remember, it works.